Hey everyone, welcome to part 3 of donations tax. We're going to pick up right where we left off. So where we left off was looking at general exemptions. We looked at the 100,000 for a natural person. Pardon me. We looked at 10,000 for a non-natural person, and then we looked at the idea of maintenance. Okay. Now we also have to look at the idea that donations are not always going to be as obvious as they might seem. Now, what Section 58 speaks about is whenever property has been disposed of for consideration, which is in the opinion of SARS not adequate, meaning that you're selling something but not for what it's worth. Now, we're not talking about, selling it for a little bit less than what it's worth. What we're talking about here are situations whereby you are selling an asset worth R1,000,000 and you're selling it for R100,000. That's clearly trying to disguise something that is a donation, but by saying there's a small payment that it's not a donation. In this case, what SARS says is that you're deemed to have donated the property at market value, less anything the person pays. So if it's worth R1,000,000, you sell it to them for R100,000, you're deemed to dispose of the property or donate the property at R1,000,000 less 100, so 9.999 million, and that's going to be subject to donations tax. The fair market value is defined as the price between willing buyer and willing seller in arm's length. Sounds a bit like accounting there. So yeah, look out for situations whereby you're told that you give the asset for less than market value, and situations where it looks obvious that you're trying to disguise a donation. In that case, SARS is going to deem you to have disposed of it at market value. Now, sometimes valuing the asset is going to be quite difficult, just because it's easy enough when you give a house, it's easy enough when you give a car, because you can just value them. But what happens if stuff gets a bit more interesting? So what if I tell you, hey, I'm going to donate to you the right to live in my house for the next 5 years, or I'm going to donate to you the right to use my car for 4 years, or maybe I'll give you the right to live in my flat until you die or I die. It might get a bit tougher. So Section 62 speaks about scenarios whereby you have to value assets in a certain way. Now, the general one, the obvious one, any value is going to be at market value. So when you donate something, it's at market value. Pretty obvious. Some exceptions, if something is used for farming, so if you donate a farm, you use 70% of its value. Why? Who knows? But that's what we're told to do, so that's what we do. So if you see any donations of a farm, you need to know you use 70% of that market value. But we also need special rules for some other things. For example, I told you can live in a house for 10 years but not own it. How do you value it? And these special things have some special names. So we're going to look at fiduciary interests, usufruct, spare dominions, and rights to annuity. As I take a pause here, I realized in the second video I said we might. I was hoping to get it done in 2. That was clearly overreaching because this is going to take 3, maybe 4 little videos. Okay, now what we have is some special scenarios. The first one, a fiduciary interest. It's created when a person donates property to another person, okay, on condition that ownership will pass to a third person on the death of the fiduciary. Okay, so what basically this means, I donate property to somebody on the condition that when that person dies, that item goes to somebody that I say it will go to. Okay, so let's give an example. I donate property to Mrs. Hummel, okay, on condition that if Mrs. Hummel was to pass away, that property will then go to my wife, let's say. That would be an example of a fiduciary interest. Mrs. Hummel has the right to use the property while she's alive, but if she was to ever pass away, it will go to my wife, not to who Mrs. Hummel chooses. Okay. Quite similar to this is a usufruct. If I grant somebody the right to use an asset, but not the right to own it. So if I say to Mrs. Hummel, hey, you can use my house, you can use my car for this amount of time or for however long until I die, whatever it might be, she doesn't own it, but she has the right to use it. That is known as a usufruct. Very similar to fiduciary interest, the only difference is what happens when the person who holds it dies. Then we have what's called a bare dominium. It's the ownership of the property without the right of use. So if I give somebody the usufruct, where's my hand? There it is. That gives them the right to use the asset, but somebody still will own it and not have the right to use it. That's called the bare dominium. If you take the bare dominium and the usufruct together, they equal full ownership. It's like splitting out the right of use and the right to own. What you might want to think about here, it's a bit like saying to somebody, hey, you can have the fruit from my tree for this amount of time, but you can't have the tree itself. There was a case we did quite a while ago, the Geldenhuys case. You would have done it in the first or second week of tax 2, where the person sold the wool from the sheep, or sold the sheep, but didn't actually have the rights to the sheep. The son did. She only had the usufruct. And in that case, the money didn't accrue to her, it accrued to the bare dominium holder, because they actually owned the right to the sheep. The old lady only owned the right to the wool. So there's some examples of what this might look like. Now, the difficulties is how to value this. It's pretty difficult. So that's what I said earlier. Usufruct is usufruct plus bare dominium equals full ownership. So the full value of the asset must be split between those two in some way. The difference between a usufruct and a fiduciary interest is what happens on death. Okay, so just have a look at that. Cool. Now, how we value them. Valuing of fiduciary interest and usufructs is a bit difficult. And what we basically have to look at is to see, well, what is the benefit you're getting and how long are you getting it for? What we do is we say, well, let's take the market value of the asset. Let's say that it is worth 12% a year. That's the number that SARS came up with. And what we then do is we say, cool, we take the value of the asset, multiply it by 12% to get an annual value. And then we need to determine how long this usufruct is going to be useful for. And what we do is we say, well, it's going to be the lesser of the life of the donor, the person who gave the asset, the life of the donee, the person who's receiving the asset, or the limited period if you say, well, you can only have it for 5 years or whatever it might be. What you then need to do is to work out the present value of an annuity at 12% based on these things here. You then take that present value of the annuity and multiply it by the annual value. Now, I know what I'm saying here probably makes close to 0 sense. I'm going to try and break it up a little easier. You have a house. You give somebody the right to live in that house for 10 years. What you do is you take the value of the whole house and multiply it by 12%, because that's an expected return that you might get from the house. Its value for the year. Think of it like rent. Then what you do is you say, well, how long is this person going to get use of this house? Remember, they don't own it, they just have the right to use it. And 3 things would pretty much stop it. The death of the donor, the death of the donee, or, the 5-year period. And what you need to then do is say, well, how long are each of these expected to happen? 5 years, quite simple, it's 5 years. But the life of the donor and the life of the donee. Well, it sounds very morbid again. It's maybe not the best time to be doing all these subjects. What you have to do is work out how much longer each of these people are expected to live. And you do this by looking at a table that says, if you are this many years old, this is how many years you have expected to live. And that's the period we're going to use. Now, what you're looking for is the lesser of these 3. Once you've got that value, the amount of time, whether it being the period or the number of years expected to be left of life, you look that up into an annuity table and you see, hey, what is the factor of present valuing this annuity at 12%? Once you've got that factor, you multiply it by the annual value, and that gives you the value of the usufruct on which you have to pay donations tax. Okay. How you value a bare dominium is you work out the value of the usufruct, and what you simply do then is take market value less the value of the usufruct, and that gives you the value of the bare dominium. If you have the full value and you have the value of the usufruct, you can work out the value of the bare dominium. The only difference in this case, it's over the lesser of the life of the donee or the stipulated period, not the life of the donor. So the value of doing usufruct this way may be slightly different to doing it this way. Okay. The right to an annuity is valued in the same way as a fiduciary interest and a usufruct, except the annual amount is just the amount of the annuity that you receive. Cool. This 12% is in terms of the Income Tax Act. It's given by SARS. But if you have some kind of an asset that you're donating that can't get 12% per year, so it only maybe earns 8, whatever it could be, you can ask SARS and they can lower it. At the same time, where do you get this information about ages from? Well, there's a table called the Life Expectancy and Annuity Factor tables in Table A and Table B. What you do for a natural person, you look at Table A and you say, well, cool, what is their age next birthday? So how old are they turning? You look it up in the table and you get the factor and you use that factor. If it is a company, you use the period of 50 years. Cool. I'll stop here for a little bit of interesting stuff. I might have told you this before, but I sometimes ask the class who gets taxed more, men or women, and everybody goes, no, it's the same. Oh, technically is, but when we're doing donations tax, women are generally better at living longer than men. So in the table, women are expected to live longer than men, which means they're expected to use the usufruct for a longer period, which means that technically they would actually get taxed slightly more as a woman than a man. But technically they're also expected to get the benefit for a bit longer. So yes, that's how it works. If you like it or not, that's how it is. Interesting, but probably not something you're going to come across too often. Okay, what we have here is we have some class examples. Now, what you're going to see is that you can look at these in your memos, but I'm going to give you some good news. The solutions to class example 1 talk you through the process of how this works, but you'll see there's a slide after class example 2. So I'm just going through it. If you want to work through these, you can, but here's the good news for you. You do not need to know how to do the valuation calculations. You used to have to. In probably about 4 or 5 years ago when I was a student, I had to. It was lots of fun. But now you don't have to. What you do have to know how to do is deal with stuff when you're given the value of a usufruct or a bare dominium. So you need to be able to deal with a situation and know what they are when the question tells you, hey, the bare dominium is worth 2 million, the usufruct is worth 3 million, we donate the bare dominium. You need to know what donations tax is on. You don't need to know how to calculate it. And what you're going to see in your question books and some old questions, if you do them, there's going to be the calculations, and the calculations are going to look like this. They're going to have the annual amount multiplied by 12%, gives you this. They're going to give you the annuity stuff. You don't have to do that. You just have to deal with the situation whereby you get told the annuity is worth the usufruct is worth this, the bare dominium is worth this. This is what I have to know how to do. The worst it could be, I tell you, the market value is this, the usufruct is this, work out the value of the bare dominium. In which case you will just go, hey, usufruct plus bare dominium equals full value. I can rearrange that so I know what the value of the bare dominium, usufruct, whatever you are looking for, is. Okay. In the last part, what we're going to do is just go through a little example together. We're not going to have enough time to do it in this one, so I'll postpone it to the next one. But what you need to take away from this video, or this little part of the video, is to remember, going back here, we've done quite a bit in this one, the general exemptions, what a deemed donation is, all right, what kind of property and how we value it, as well as these special types where you're not giving ownership, but you're giving right of use. Just remember, you can split it up and give one person the usufruct and one person the bare dominium. Okay. We looked at the general process of how to value limited rights, which is what we call this, but then we came to the good news and said that, hey, actually, we are lucky we don't have to do this.